Let's cross live now to our political editor, Lyndal Curtis, who's joined by the Immigration Minister, Chris Bowen.
Chris Bowen, welcome to ABC News 24.
Good morning, Lyndal.
Four Corners last night alleged at least 7 people smugglers have come into Australia on 2 boats and been granted, in a relatively short period of time, protection visas and Australian residency. A ringleader, Captain Emad, is said to have come in on the 13th of January 2010 under the name Ali Al-Abbasi with his daughter-in-law and her child. What are you doing about these allegations?
Well, firstly, Lyndal, when we have somebody who's been granted refugee status, if it can be established that that was based on wrong information, that they provided wrong information, then that refugee status can be revoked. And there have been instances in the past where that's occurred. Now, these were allegations aired last night. Obviously, I've asked my department to examine those allegations and to assess whether there is a case to answer for refugee status to be revoked in any particular instance.
How long would that process take?
Well, Lyndal, as I say, we've seen allegations. It's appropriate they be dealt with appropriately and carefully. We are talking about serious allegations that must be carefully assessed. But I don't have any tolerance at all for people gaining refugee status based on false information. There have been instances in the past where refugee status has been revoked, either the department doing it or me using my personal powers, when information has come to light which wasn't at hand when refugee status was granted. And of course, there are instances where that is appropriate, and there needs to be a proper examination as whether that's the case in this instance.
If Four Corners is right, Captain Emad, even if he's not a people smuggler, is a businessman. He has a business in Malaysia. His family also came out on asylum seeker boats in 2009. If that's proved, they are not refugees, are they?
Well, again, that's an allegation. Lyndal, an allegation made on a television program, which we take seriously, but of course the Department of Immigration and various review mechanisms look at a whole lot of information. Now, again, all the information will be examined to see whether the information provided to the department and assessed at the time was correct information and valid, and then appropriate decisions can be made about whether there's a case to answer for refugee status to be revoked in any instance.
Four Corners says that the alleged people smugglers were granted refugee visas in a short period of time, 2 to 3 months for those on the boat that came in on the 13th of January 2010. Will you also be looking at whether that process was too quick, whether the Federal Police should investigate, and whether ASIO should look at its own processes?
Well, let's take this one step at a time, and I'll deal with each of those 3 questions, Lyndal. Firstly, I must say, normally when I'm on the ABC, I'm criticised for the process taking too long or being too rigorous. We do have a rigorous approach, which does mean that people are rejected for refugee status. And the latest figures are that around half people are rejected at primary assessment for refugee status. In relation to ASIO, we do have ASIO doing assessments of people, and we do have people who are denied a permanent visa because of their links to people smuggling, their people smuggling activity. And again, often on the ABC, I'm criticised for that process being too rigorous, but I make no apologies for that. Of course, in relation to those allegations made, and I'm not able to comment on whether the AFP has had an interest in this individual in the past. That's entirely an operational matter for the AFP, which ministers can't comment upon. But the AFP, what I can say, the AFP have arrested 14 people smuggling organisers, which has resulted in a number of 7-year sentences. So the AFP is very active here, and of course if there's evidence that the AFP can look at, then they will be looking at it.
Because Four Corners has alleged that these alleged people smugglers are operating not only in Australia but in Canberra, relatively close to Parliament House, your own department, and the AFP. Have they slipped through the net?
Well, I'm not able to comment, Lyndal, as I say, on whether the AFP was already investigating this individual. I just can't comment on whether that's the case or not. But clearly, the AFP and my department and ASIO examines a whole range of information that they have about individuals, and they'll examine information which has come to hand as a result of the program last night, because I have zero tolerance for people providing wrong information to any government agency. From time to time, information is brought to our attention, and from time to time refugee status can be and has been revoked.
What does it say about the refugee system if your government has allowed people smugglers to come into Australia, granted them refugee visas, even given them public housing, and allowed them to continue their business?
Well, again, Lyndal, we have an allegation aired on a television program last night. was a serious allegation around a small number of people, but a serious allegation. Now, I thought last night's program was actually a pretty powerful argument for offshore processing and talked about the dangers of travel at sea, one of the things I've put the case for consistently. It talked about the difficulties of assessing refugee claims. I've consistently put the case that it would be much better to have people processed offshore and referred to Australia by the UNHCR, where all these matters can be assessed, not onshore. And I think that's, as I say, last night was a powerful argument for offshore processing. And as I say, Lyndal, I'm often criticised, particularly on the ABC, for having too rigorous a process in place, for having too many checks and for the process taking too long. I thought, again, last night's episode was an exposition as to why we have these rigorous checks in place. If somebody has gotten through that net, then that is something that can be rectified and will be rectified.
The reporter who did the story, Sarah Ferguson, also said yesterday, while it was not included in the program, that the wife of one of the alleged people smugglers in Sydney works in your department. Will you be investigating that?
Yes, I saw that suggestion. Again, it wasn't on the program. That was a suggestion that was made in the media yesterday for the first time, and of course its veracity will be checked.
Labor was scathing when the Howard government alleged terrorists could be brought into Australia on asylum seeker boats. If Four Corners is true, doesn't that mean criminals are coming in?
Well, an allegation has been made that a people smugglers come in as an asylum seeker. Again, Lyndal, I stress, we have people who are rejected for refugee status, many people, because their claims don't stack up. And sometimes we're criticised for then seeking to return those people to the country from whence they've come. But that's an important part of our refugee status assessment. And again, we have people in detention because they're regarded as risks to national security, either through people smuggling activities or through other activities. Again, we're sometimes criticised for that, but I think it shows some of the complexities that we're dealing with here and some of the challenges of dealing with onshore arrivals, and it again shows why offshore processing is a preferred way forward.
The immigration system is only as strong and accepted by the population if people have confidence in it. Doesn't this instance potentially taint that confidence?
Well, I think people are right to be concerned about the integrity of our immigration system. Of course they are. I am as well concerned to make sure that our immigration system is as robust as possible. I think there's a number of elements that go to public confidence in immigration. Yes, I think that offshore processing and a more orderly process is important in terms of improving public confidence in immigration. I also think that some of the irresponsible claims we see made by some politicians about the numbers involved and about some of the risks involved sometimes unfortunate and do go to public confidence. I think there's a range of elements involved. I think one of my roles is to obviously talk about the benefits of a strong migration policy, whether it be skilled or humanitarian or family reunion. It's something I do ad nauseum, and there are always complex issues involved. And yes, when there's allegations made, they need to be dealt with seriously, just as we're dealing seriously with the allegations made last night on Four Corners.
We'll come to skilled migration in a moment, but when Labor came to power, you effectively dismantled the offshore processing system. You've been retrofitting it ever since then. You haven't been able to get the new system you want operating. At what point do you say that if you really want to stop the people smuggling trade, stop people dying while they make that journey to Australia, that you have to accept that whatever you think of the Howard government solution, at least it stopped the boats coming?
Well, we've already said that we would open a detention centre at Nauru. Not an easy decision for the government to make. But we said that as a matter of good faith. We wrote to the Leader of the Opposition and said, let's get together. You agree with offshore processing, we agree with offshore processing, and as part of that regime, we will open a detention centre at Nauru. But we need the legislation passed. That's been rejected out of hand by the Opposition.
So at what point do you say you are not going to get the Malaysia solution and Nauru and Manus Island, which is the package you want, through the Parliament, so you accept that you can have processing on Nauru and Manus Island and then maybe look at reintroducing what the Opposition wants, which is temporary protection visas. If that stops the boats, then it means there won't be that many people on temporary protection visas because they won't be coming to Australia. Well,
again, Lyndal, we need to be able to justify policy decisions we make. I could not justify saying we'll open a detention centre at Nauru for which people will then be processed settled in Australia after they've been found to be refugees, which was the case under the Howard government. We offered an independent inquiry into temporary protection visas. We pointed out that the number of people arriving by boat went up after the introduction of temporary protection visas, but that we were happy to have an independent inquiry with the personnel jointly chosen between the government and the opposition, and the terms of reference jointly chosen between the government and the opposition.
But you have not been able to make that happen, have you?
Well, you're right to say that the opposition has rejected working with the government to implement offshore processing. That is correct. That means, as we move to implement offshore processing, we do so with zero assistance from the opposition, unlike John Howard, who needed the assistance of Kim Beazley. I mean, it's all very well for Mr Abbott to say, well, we're not the government. When John Howard went to Kim Beazley and said, I can't introduce offshore processing without your support in the Senate, Kim Beazley provided that support, even though he didn't agree with every element of the government's policies. What that shows is that Kim Beazley was more prepared to act in the national interest and to do the right thing than Tony Abbott is.
If we could go now to the approval of an enterprise migration agreement at Gina Rinehart's Roy Hill mine. You've said you've told the Prime Minister's office gave them a full briefing. The agreement was about to be signed on the Tuesday before it was signed. What consultations were held with the government before that?
Lyndal, we've been through these issues ad nauseum. I've answered questions in the Parliament about this. What is clear here is that we have an agreement which can see 8,000 jobs be created, 6,700 jobs for Australians, which would not proceed without this agreement. So I understand this is difficult politics, but this is important politics and important policy. And we've put public policy first here by saying we recognise that one of the biggest challenges for big mining projects going ahead is getting the skilled labour necessary. And we want Australians to have the first chance for those jobs, and they do and will have the first chance for those jobs. But if they are unable to be filled by domestic Australian workers, then we've underwritten a program going forward to allow up to 1,700 457 visas on that 8,000 person project. And if we didn't make these sorts of arrangements, as was recommended by the National Resources Sector Employment Task Force in 2010 and announced in the 2011 budget, then we would see a real risk of some of these projects creating jobs for Australians not proceeding.
Was the Prime Minister at the Productivity Committee of Cabinet meetings you said you kept informed?
Lyndal, I'm not going to traverse this old ground. I've answered questions in the Parliament about this. Clearly, this has been something that was announced in the 2011 budget and is now being appropriately implemented by the government.
How did an agreement which guarantees the jobs for more than 6,000 Australians in the mining industry become a problem to the point where Gary Gray, one of the ministers involved in the process, his pre-selection is being threatened by unions?
Well, Gary Gray is a first-class minister. He always acts with the best interests of Australian workers at heart, and I think that people need to reflect on some of the things that this government and Gary Gray have delivered in terms of workplace reform. Gary Gray recommended this after close consultation with a range of stakeholders, and I think we all need to prosecute the case for this important reform, and to point out, for example, that although it's controversial, although it's difficult, we do need to make difficult decisions in the national interest from time to time, and every minister sometimes needs to explain controversial decisions, and I'm no stranger to doing that.
One final question. Do you take any of the blame for the way this was handled?
Well, Lyndal, I take responsibility for the policy. It's a good one. It's a policy which creates 6,700 jobs. I also take responsibility for explaining difficult issues in the Australian political discourse. It's something that I do as Immigration Minister. It's welcome to being Immigration Minister. Sometimes you've got to explain difficult and complex things. It's just part and parcel of the job.
Chris Bowen, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Lyndal.